right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Forest Euphoria will be on sale up at the register, and Patricia will be signing after our conversation. You can always go to oblongbooks.com to check out further events. We've got a lot of great ones coming up this summer. So I'm going to read a quick bio and then we'll get into it. Patricia Ononiwu Kaishian is the curator of mycology at New York State Museum, as well as faculty with the Bard Prison Initiative. She earned her PhD from City College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and she lives in the Hudson Valley. So congratulations on the publication of Forest Euphoria, and happy Pride.
Thank you, yeah, I'm so happy you're all here. Thanks for coming and listening to me. I'll do a little reading and we'll have a conversation. I'm really excited to chat with you all. And then hopefully, at the end, feel free to ask questions. So, I'm just really grateful for your time and attention. I guess I'll just sort of talk about a little bit what brought me to writing the book and sort of the themes of the book. So, this is a blend of memoir and science writing and nonfiction, and it is a collection of chapters that each dives into a different species or biological system that is queer in either a literal reproductive sense or takes on a slightly more expansive interpretation of the concept of queerness, and I think that's something we could talk a little bit more about in terms of what exactly I mean by that. I wrote, at first when I started writing the book, I was approaching the topic as a scientist because that's like what my academic training and formal training is in. Meaning I wanted to tell people about how literally queer nature is and how there's all sorts of ways that we see the material world, biological systems that are informed by science, but a scientific perspective that is not detached from who we are as people and how society functions and how power and hierarchies can affect sort of our own interpretation of information. But as I started writing and drafting, I realized that the more personal element of my life and my experience in nature was one that I think needed to be part of the conversation. Because my goal in writing the book, there are many goals really, but one of them was to help people understand that they can see themselves in nature, and in order for us all to sort of develop and deepen a sense of responsibility and stewardship of nature. So that was one goal. But I wanted to also address the charge that is so often brought against queerness, right? Which is that it's not natural. It's not. So often you hear that any type of same-sex behavior or anything that's not heteronormative is unnatural. It's a perversion of nature. It's something that is an aberration. And from a scientific perspective, and particularly as someone who studies fungi, I knew that wasn't accurate. It's simply false that everything in nature is a binary, that there's clearly always just two types of sexes, or that there's never same-sex behaviors or even sexual transitions to sexually transition as in being transgender. These things all exist in nature, and I study fungi, so I knew that not only do they exist, but they're within that kingdom of fungi extremely common. There's so many examples of queerness in fungi. We have fungi with thousands of different mating types. We have fungi that have multiple sexes in one body. We have whole orders of fungi that just are only known to be asexual. There's so many variations of reproductive strategies that you can't even neatly summarize them. So the whole concept of a binary is often just even an irrelevant, just an irrelevant notion to try to apply to all sorts of life. And then if you go beyond that into animals and plants, you find just no shortage of examples. So I wanted to just at first write about those things, but then I guess as I thought about my own life and my own journey as a queer person, as a person who spent a tremendous amount of time in nature, I started to reflect on the power of being in community with other species, and how that can be radically transformative to your own sense of self, to your sense of belonging, to your relationship to place. And it just became like the way to tell that story was through the more personal element. So in that case, it becomes this blended book between, where over the arc of the book, I share stories from my childhood, and then over the course of my life becoming a scientist, and then I blend that with natural history explorations of queerness in nature, and then these more abstract notions of queerness as well, queerness as a social, a way of understanding how power functions. So, yeah.
I'm really glad that shaping the book took that journey, because you just touched on so many of the things I loved about the book, but one of the things I love the most is the intertwining of the personal and the scientific, because in reality we can't separate that. We can't separate ourselves from nature. You hear about humans and nature as two distinct things, and they're really not. Which we both learned in ESF.
Yes.
So speaking of, I'm going to bring it back to the very personal and tell you all about how I first heard about the book, which was a friend just sending me a screenshot of the basic summary of the book. And I read it, and then I read it again, and I was like, because it's a memoir in part, the summation of the book is a lot of personal details about you. You grew up most at home in the outdoors, the swamps and culverts of the Hudson Valley. So did I. That's amazing. You felt very out of place. Connecting to nature helped you make understanding of your queer and neurodivergent identities. Me too. Wow. You went to SUNY ESF. You got a PhD there. I went to SUNY ESF. Wow, so similar. You came back to the Hudson Valley. You started getting involved in prison initiatives. For you, the Bard Prison Initiative. I also did that. I came back and started working at Oblong and helped bring the Beacon Prison Books project here. So just from the jump, I was immediately like frothing at the mouth, needing to read this book, needing to do this event. Then I actually started reading the book, and it got weirder. Had we both been born biologically male, we both would have been named Matthew.
Okay. Interesting.
We're both Scorpios. We both love the color purple. It just like
God.
layer after layer of the personal, and it made me really think about the book as a whole, and the fact that what drew me to it was the things we have in common, the sameness. But one of the overarching themes of the book, I would say, is its philosophy that sameness is something we're drawn to, but it's not necessarily what makes us whole. It's different from oneness, and what makes that possible is diversity and difference. And there are a lot of like really beautiful themes in the book, but that was one that I was really drawn to.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of similarity. So I think it's worth noting. Like it is exciting when there's so much similarity, and I do think that people who sometimes who grow up not feeling at home are often extra craving that, or not feeling at home in like the dominant society or in their family networks, or in various ways through queerness or neurodivergence or racial ambiguity, all these different things. You are looking for that, and I think I still am, as someone, as I think it's very normal for people to seek that. But I also, I think, had to learn at a younger age that I might not find exactly what I was looking for in terms of seeing exactly the sort of cultural or ways of being a human reflected back at me, at the people around me. And I needed to find a different way of making a community. And so I think queerness in general kind of often puts people in that position where you have to, I talk a little bit about this idea of like a forager methodology, where you have to kind of go and collect the things that you want to create for yourself in terms of creating a sense of belonging, creating ritual, culture, tradition. Because sometimes you're exiled from that, or you just don't, it doesn't sit with your values, or whatever it may be. So in doing that, in that process of being othered, you often you make kin with other beings that are either other people in a similar situation who may not be all that similar to you, but maybe just by virtue of being queer have also are looking for something. But also, so I think there was something about me as a young child sort of primed, even though I didn't, of course, have any analysis for it at the time, was primed to be needing that type of connection and realizing that maybe the best way to find that was not to try to find something ultimately that looked just like me, but seeing community, seeing family, seeing kinship in other species, and finding, dealing as a way of processing sort of the challenges that were happening to me that were happening by and from people, seeing how there was both difference and commonality in other species that I could sort of relate to and build community with. So yeah, I think that I also this also gets into, for me, this idea that we are, when we think about biodiversity and ecosystems and ecologies, maximally diverse ecologies are always the healthiest. Anything that, when we want to protect biodiversity, we're trying to protect the many different ways of being, and it's that's what gives those habitats or systems their strength and their resilience in a very literal, quantifiable sense. Ecologically, we can quantify the capacity for a community to overcome disease or stress if the greater the diversity in the space. And so there's definitely that's something also I wanted to bring in both literal and abstract ways in terms of thinking of human society and human culture as well.
Yeah, you talk in the book about there being dual lenses of looking at things through, and I thought a lot while I was at ESF, and I still think a lot about how many scientists really like to think of science as this unbiased thing, but as human beings, it's just impossible for us to be unbiased, to not have a lens that we view the world through. And I think it's really important to be intentional about learning what possible lenses there are and deciding for ourselves how we want to view the world.
Definitely, yeah. So I as a scientist, I'm very science positive. I believe in science as a very powerful tool. I'm not interested in anti-intellectual attacks against science. I think that those are, I'm not trying to erode science. But I'm also, I think, what part of your training as a scientist is to be critical, right, of the processes that the papers that you're reading, the data that you're examining, and trying to, make sure you're truly understanding it. So I do think that good science, part of the power of science is the fact that it has within its system a feedback, a self-check-in, these feedback mechanisms where we do peer review, and we open, we put papers out there so that they can be, we can be transparent with the data and stuff like that. So I definitely just always to make it very plainly clear that I'm very pro-science, but it is at the end of the day a social project. It is something that is done by people who are situated in a particular social, political context. They have only, there's a philosopher I really like, Donna Haraway. She talks about the partial perspective. You only have ever a partial perspective, right? And then you do your best with science to knit together many different partial perspectives to create a whole quilt of information that then you can view from a step back and hopefully understand, a lot about the universe, and that is something that we do. But any time a person is experiencing something, looking at their data, looking at a system, a phenomenon, and trying to understand it, they're bringing with them they're seeing the world through the lens of their culture and their experiences, and that's just something you can't change that about yourself. But what you can do is reflect on that, and you can see, okay, how may my social and political experiences, or my family life, or anything, inform the way I'm seeing this situation. And so when you do go through the history of science and the philosophy of science, you start to see that there are a lot of instances where people were very clearly functioning from a position of social bias, and it is in the evidence in the science. So it's not in the evidence, I guess, in the it's not in the scientific evidence. It's in the like the canon. It's in the it's recorded, built into the literature that people were, for example, not recording instances of same-sex behaviors amongst birds or amongst apes or amongst beetles, because they were trained either they didn't even notice it because they weren't looking for it, because they were expecting to see a particular type of male female sexual interaction, or they saw it and thought it was some sort of that was just a weird little one-off thing, I'm not going to record that. Or they did record it, but then they had second thoughts and that they shouldn't publish this because this is going to put people are going to be critical of their work because they're going to be accused of being gay, right? Or maybe they'll be banned from even their institution where they're teaching or working for having some sort of gay agenda, right? So we have a lot of instances of this in the scientific record where the social political forces shaped scientific knowledge, and in these cases it leads to a decline in knowledge. It creates either false knowledge or it obscures true information, and so I do think it's a key responsibility of scientists and people interested in science to hold a magnifying lens up to the scientific record and understand how can we improve our scientific knowledge by examining the biases that we hold and held historically.
And I think that's part of the strength of diversity in science specifically, in that we can't always see our own blind spots, but somebody coming from a totally different worldview, a different perspective can say, hey, you missed that.
Right.
You didn't see that because of the way you're looking at the world.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that sometimes people might respond, oh, why are you politicizing science? Science is objective, and it's actually the political or the social sort of bias was introduced before by someone else, and I'm looking to undo that, to strengthen science to learn more about the world, not to discard science, but to say, hey, we've got this wrong, or we need to see this more clearly. We can do so by breaking down this box, or sort of re-examining the way in which we're approaching this question altogether.
And I think that is one of the beautiful things about science, because it is ever evolving. It's building on itself rather than being a static thing. And I think queerness and otherness of all kinds really lends itself to self-reflection and looking at the world in different ways. So I think that's part of why it's so important to include all voices and even perspectives that may seem wildly wacky at first. I think in the Magnetism of Eels essay you talk about how eels for most of their life are not gendered. They don't have secondary sex characteristics. They don't even have gonads of any type. And originally, rather than thinking, well, this is a different thing, there was the idea of spontaneous generation. So they just were created out of the muck. That's just how it happened, rather than think oh, these beings have a different biology than me that I don't understand. They just come from mud.
Right.
But one of the things I love is this book could just be a list of all the weird and queer animals that are different than what meet our expectations, but it centers wonder and curiosity and this deep and abiding love of nature and the world, because we're a part of nature. And I think part of maybe sectioning things off from ourselves comes from this natural disgust and fear reaction. It's a knee-jerk thing. I know, when I was a kid, I was afraid of spiders. The people around me were, and I had to eventually tell myself, they're not doing anything to me. How do I, train myself out of this fear? And I was wondering, have you found that knee-jerk reaction within yourself, and how have you cultivated curiosity instead?
Yeah. So I talk about how my first loves in the book were like my life. Were snakes, reptiles, swamp creatures, the swamp itself, the muck. I really did always kind of like these things, maybe a little more than average. So I didn't have a group of organisms that like deeply disgusted me or I was deeply afraid of. I would say that like I have had to like, I think even, I think I took a kind of a while to understand my own queerness though. And I think that it was a process. So it's not, I wouldn't say I had any feelings of disgust, but I definitely had my own internalized phobias about my own body and my own way of being and relating to the world. And it was feelings of like, well, it maybe shouldn't be like that. And so I do think that when I would go out and look at all these other species, they're not thinking I shouldn't be like that, or and maybe people are telling that like maybe we as a society are saying we don't like these creatures, they're weird and creepy and we like want them banished, but they're not taking that on, right? And so there was definitely I guess it's not fully addressing your question, but I think because the answer is really kind of no, I didn't ever really feel that, but I think that I did start to see the parallels of like there are so many different ways of being, and nothing is, aside, when we're talking about just your own self-expression, your own gender identity, your own consensual sexual interactions, there isn't a prescription, right, that is worth following, and then you can learn that from nature, and I think the ways in which they unsettle us are sometimes opportunities to learn, like, well, what am I actually reacting towards? If the way this creature is moving is unsettling to me, well, what about it is, why am I feeling I need to control this situation? Why am I feeling that I need to crush it or dominate it? And so I do think that kind of like sitting with the discomfort of like the reaction. You're not like a bad person if you're afraid of spiders, right? But maybe like thinking, okay, well, what is it that I'm actually bothered by? Is it the fact that they have autonomy? Is it that they move in ways that beguile me and I don't like know what to expect? And like where might else that be kind of what else? How can I reflect on that in a sort of more personal or sort of social way as well?
Well, and I think that really speaks to how this division of humans from nature is not anything we can separate from our divisions between ourselves. It's this binary type of thinking. I am this, you are that, we are different, we can't. But in reality, those are our strengths. And one thing you were talking about was the naming of species and honoring them, and that is a type of division. That's saying this is distinct in this way, and the book is very good at holding two things at once. You can name something and say it's different and honor that, but not say because it's different, it's apart.
Yeah, I tried to like. So I talk about this idea of like becoming, like I talk about this, so Robin Wall Kimmerer, I'm sure many of you know her work quite well. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass and other books, but she talks about this idea of like becoming indigenous to place as a way of like, okay, we cannot necessarily change the colonial history of America or the world, but we can, but we are still obligated as, if you're a settler, to become a steward of the land that you're on, to deeply love it, to act, to treat it with reverence and as it's a sacred thing. And so kind of as a corollary to that, I bring in this phrase that I thought of like the becoming queer to place, right? Which is that you may be like, it's about how do like we make peace with the fact that we're all like we can be we're not necessarily from here in the deep ancestral way that Indigenous people are, but we are nonetheless here. We're full of contradictions sometimes. Like we're full of, like, you can be many things at once, but you can, you know, still be, I don't know, committed to your principles. There's ways in which there's not always like a resolvable answer to a lot of things, right? How do we like make our system of ethics clear when the world is so complex, right? When we're not always able to live in the ways that we need to live to be in perfect, you know, harmony with nature. How do we sort of make peace with ourselves, make peace with sort of our, I guess I find guidance and direction. So I feel like that's something that I think about a lot too, which is that like you can't, I didn't want to like have this book be this like a text where I'm drawing the like lots of conclusions around identity. That identity can be like, it's a tool to understanding like very important aspects of our humanity, but it can also be overly rigid or overly prescribed or kind of create reinforce differences when solidarity is what we need. So yeah, I kind of talk also, I'm a taxonomist, so I look for and name and describe new species of fungi. And in doing that, yeah, I am, like, it is a little ironic sometimes as a queer person to think about this, that I am drawing these neat little boxes around species and trying to, like, clearly I understand them. But for me, like, the idea that, like, species concepts are useful in particular, you know, situations to be able to understand, for instance, that there are millions of species of fungi on the earth, and we've only described like 3 to 5% of them, and that they are these, like, it is worth talking about that there's all this diversity of form, but also like that diversity of form is not maybe the difference is maybe not the most important thing about these things. So yeah, there's a lot, it's hard to like wrap a bow on it, but that's why I wrote it.
But that's, I kind of love books that make me think and kind of expand my understanding of what can be, and that was what I found in this book. And bring it back to queer to place, this idea, one of the things you wrote about it is that it's an active and humble commitment. And I think that's really important in that, like, you're giving that respect and putting the effort in and contributing back as much as you can, whether or not your heritage is rooted within this place. And one of the things you talk about as well is the idea of landscape as identity and how it shapes cultures and languages over time. But many people in many different contexts are removed from the place that birthed their culture. And that's very true for you as well. You grew up Armenian and Irish in North America. So can you talk a little bit about that disconnection from those places and how you built connection here? And did you get like stories as a child about the landscape there? What was that like for you?
Sure, yeah. And maybe this would be like a section. I might read, I'll answer the question to start, and then I might read a little bit from this section, like about, there's a passage that might be good for sharing at that point. But I will say that, okay, yeah, so I'm Armenian and Irish. My Armenian side escaped the Armenian genocide in 1915. They came to New York around that time. The Armenian genocide is one that's not well understood by people outside of the Armenian or West Asian diaspora. It's not often talked about. So, and I didn't really grow up in a Armenian area. So I was kind of left to, like, there were like very Armenian aspects of my life. My last name, Kaishian, is Armenian. But, and we would eat Armenian food and we had Armenian carpets in the house, but I didn't have Armenian friends. I didn't grow up speaking the language. I think that there was a tremendous amount of trauma, and there's like, two, like, there's kind of two types of like responses to trauma that I often see, right? There's some people like talk about it a lot and move through it that way, and then some people just never speak of it. And so in my family it was more of the never speak of it thing. So I just didn't, I had to learn a lot of it on my own in terms of Armenian culture and stories. I had to seek it out, and occasionally it would be brought to me. Like occasionally, I have a very vivid memory of my grandfather, just sort of seemingly out of nowhere. Like I wasn't asking him about stories of what happened, but he just at a family party like pulled me aside and told me some of the things that our family survived, like what those that survived experienced, and many did not survive. So like, and it came out in this like torrent of information. I was like, wow, so I was like, wow, I didn't even know this was all in there, right? So that kind of being a person from a group of people that was mostly exterminated and then that few people know about is a strange thing to be a couple generations removed from that. It is like a deeply lonely thing, and there's something we know in biology about it, like epigenetics, that some trauma, particularly from cataclysmic events such as genocide, exist in generationally, right? It like lives on for many generations. So I think that that's just always really been a very big part of my life. And so I think I've always wanted to understand what it would feel like to be from a place that we didn't have to, like what would have been like if I grew up in Armenia? What would have felt like if I spoke the language that I knew my family was speaking for thousands of years? And I think a lot about how powerful it is to live in a place where a language that kind of arose from what I like to think of as like this ecological cradle, that humans as animals are shaped by their ecosystem evolutionarily, right? We are in this space of like giving and taking with with the other species around us, that there's pressures and responses, and it shapes culture, right? We can obviously like think about how other plants shape our culture, our foods, the teachers that we pull out as I almost said symbols, but it's usually deeper than symbols. Usually it's a profound connection to other species that exists within cultures that are indigenous to a place. And so I want to just read a little passage about that. Sorry, I didn't flag it ahead of time because
and while you search for that, I'll say like the book is really interwoven with these stories of other beings, animals, plants, fungi, and how they defy expectation, the roles we kind of assign to the world because that's how we see it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they have these deep connections to us that we can really relate to. And I think we've all experienced that, sometimes we call it personifying things or anthropomorphizing in animals, oh, that robin tilted its head in a funny way, and what's it thinking? But I think this connection to nature is just more profound than anybody realizes.
Yeah, so I'll read this part. This is I guess about because I also do talk. I am as I mentioned also Irish, so I do have like a I wanted to include some of that in the book as well. So I'll read this part. As comfortable as I am in the landscape of my birth, however, I have long felt something off, something missing. I wish when I declared this place home, I could feel it were wholly true. Part of this remove, I think, comes from language. I do not fluently speak either of the languages of my ancestors, Western Armenian or Gaelic, respectively dying and threatened languages, due to systematic destruction and assimilation. One of my great sadnesses is that I will never speak a language fluently in the ecological cradle from which it arose. A language, like symbolism, emerges in the context of its speaker's habitat, a reciprocal engagement between human and landscape. The landscape reveals, the speaker tells, and vice versa. The landscape exerts a gentle power, similar to that exercised by farmers in the Armenian highlands, who for every generation for thousands of years chose the sweetest apricots for breeding. Irish linguist Padraig O'Tuama describes Gaelic as a decidedly earthy language, one that translates the physical world very literally, sometimes severely. The Gaelic word for the plant heather, Calluna vulgaris, he says, is frorc, or fury. A foreigner might look out across the rolling pastel hills and imagine them as soft and beautiful, heather. A person familiar with the land will know that those visually inviting vistas are in fact full of brutally sharp plants that bleed the tongues of sheep, frorc. When language is layered with ecological knowledge in such a way, taking away the language can fracture a people's relationship with their ecology as well. Over the hundreds of years of British subjugation of Ireland, this is precisely what happened. Up until the 1800s, Gaelic was a predominantly oral language, which made it easier for the British to reduce its usage. Criminalizing Gaelic and forcibly converting the earthy, place-based names of Irish communities to English ones not only disoriented people socially and economically, but damaged their knowledge of their landscape. I see this loss as reciprocal, a violence felt both by the people and the landscape. When I visited Armenia, the first person in my family to return to our homeland following the genocide, I couldn't contain my desire for belonging. I wanted to walk in the mountains and feel something tremble, something to tell me with total certainty that I was home. I was unabashedly looking for magic. I expected to feel the land recognize me back, to feel the magnets click into place. As time passed and no such thing happened, I grew afraid that I had been forgotten. Too much time had passed, and my lineage was too fractured.
So beautiful. And you mentioned the word magic in there, and that's a big theme in this book, and people think of the ideas of science and magic as like totally opposed, but that's another one of those dualities that this book holds, is the sense of wonder and not understanding, and that being something that is greater than, rather than something that we need to cut up and divide and figure out. And part of the magic is in the not understanding.
Yeah. And so going back to you brought up also like seeing with multiple lenses, like I think as a scientist, sometimes other scientists I notice feel trapped with feeling like they have to only see the world as a scientist. That's the only permissible lens. You can't be religious, or you can't be into astrology or, magic or whatever it may be. And I think that I don't actually see these things as fundamentally incompatible. Like, you might not always be able to use the same lens you can't always use all the lenses at once, right? It depends on what you're trying to do. And I think it's really important that science, like, you understand when you're like using science and you're not saying something science when it's not. But I think that it's just about declaring like what framework you're using, right? So if you're using a scientific framework, then that's what's, we all, like, we're understanding that. But I can also, as a scientist, believe that in the vitalism of other species, that species are imbued with something that is not something that we can understand through science, that our relationships to each other are there's something, magical between all life on Earth, that the planet isn't just this collection of like totally reducible units. There's something vital, something sort of energetic beyond that, right? But I won't say that that's science necessarily. Like, maybe one day science will provide an answer for that, or another way of understanding it. And so that's always, an expectation with science, that what might now be considered magic would one day maybe be understood. But that doesn't mean I can't believe in the magic until we have until or unless there's a scientific explanation.
And there's so much like symbiosis in this book, and discussion of like the Gaia hypothesis, and just so many different ways of viewing the world. And that's what makes this a queer book to me, not necessarily the same-sex relationships between animals, or like the list of transgender creatures. I feel like this book defines queer as this all-encompassing ideology of connection, otherness, resilience, and strength. It's like a force that expands what's acceptable and what we can hold within ourselves to love
Yeah.
and have compassion for. So.
Definitely, and I think I want to maybe just read one more little section because about the queer, that the kind of use of queerness. What I said I would get into that, and so yeah, I'll read this sort of passage that's from the introduction. Queer is the overarching term for a whole smattering of ways of being that defy expectations of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and family structure. While the word used to be an insult to describe behaviors outside of what was normal or heteronormative, queer was reclaimed in the AIDS political activism of the 80s and 90s, bringing together different subgroups for whom the terms gay and lesbian did not apply. Importantly, queer is a call to action, charging us to reject the many binaries that shape our current reality to the detriment of everyone. And while queer is used to primarily describe categories of sex and gender that are not considered normal in today's culture, the term can also be used more broadly for anything that complicates our ideas of what is normal versus what is deviant. Queer theory asks, what has been categorized as normal and why? How does the structure of our society in the forms of race, gender, religion, orientation, ability, and even species reinforce this categorization? So for me, I think it's really important that queerness isn't understood in this sort of just like, this is a label, this is an identity that I have. It is that, but it's, to me, it's actually doing a much more important thing, which is understanding our collective responsibility to one another. And so the word was deployed to activate people collectively against a profound injustice that the U.S. government and sort of the heteronormative culture was enacting. And it was crucially organizing people across difference, right? I mean, they were similar in that they were both marginalized, all of these groups were marginalized, trans people, lesbians, gay people, but they were not the same, there were similarities, but they actually had their own interests, and they had their own subcultures, and they had their own ways of expressing themselves. But it was crucial that they came together because individually those groups were not as powerful. And so it's about understanding how power works. It's about understanding how power moves and how. And I think so. I don't just simply sit with the identity of queerness as like a jacket. It's like an animating force, right? And I think I wanted that to be like a big part of the book too.
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is "The Abounding Queerness of Nature," and from that you might think like it is just like
a compendium,
right? It's not just a bestiary of queer animals, which is one of the books you cite in this book, and one of the things I loved about this book is that it really expanded my curiosity and gave me like a mile-long reading list.
Yeah, the note section is a little bit long.
One of the books you mentioned is kind of a compendium of queer animals, and that's Biological Exuberance. And I just wanted to bring this to show you how thick this book is. It doesn't have like a lot of pictures. It doesn't have big text. This is just essentially a list of queerness in nature, and it's not. One of the things I love about Forest Euphoria is that it's not saying queerness is natural as a justification. It's saying queerness is natural as a celebration. We are part of this magnificent, strange, diverse world, and limiting ourselves by saying this is what's right, this is what's natural, it's very reductive, and it takes a lot away from us.
Yeah, I think, well, thank you. But I also appreciate that you're pulling that out specifically because it's like also like, I also talk a little bit about like part of my own experience with gender dysphoria, and like, I don't, there are some difficult themes early in the book that come up with like trauma, but I kind of reflect on like, well, and certainly, people are born gay or trans, and maybe there are life experiences that shape you.
The born this way narrative always didn't sit quite right with me,
right?
Because what if I wasn't born this way?
Yeah,
what's so wrong about queerness that making it a choice to be queer would
Be bad.
Be bad.
Right. So you in accepting that as the like necessary like bedrock, you're admitting that you wouldn't do it if
Exactly.
you
Like
weren't born this way.
if I didn't have, if I had a choice, I wouldn't be.
Which then.
But for me,
Yeah.
queerness has brought so much joy to my life. It's given me a way to see the world and connect with people who I never would have met in other ways. It's given me an understanding of myself that I mean, I could have been a very, very boring person had I not had these things that othered me, that made me reflect.
Mhm.
And I think it's just like kind of a beautiful experience to have.
Yeah, it's not always just about how, you know, things are so bad and your life sucks and so hard to be queer. You know, like there's very real, extremely real and serious challenges and threats. But it's also like there's so much beauty in it, and there's so much companionship that is like transformative, and yeah, I love being a queer person. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's part of why I'm so glad it came out during Pride Month, because Pride is like about all those things. It's about the struggle, but it's also about the beauty.
Yeah.
So we're starting to run low on time. I want to leave some room for questions. I'm gonna leave it with this, which came up for me while I was reading. There's this term from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, which it creates fake words to fill in gaps in the language. And the word that came up for me was sonder. And the definition of that is the awareness that everyone has a story. Each passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. For me, your book extends that experience to every living being on Earth.
Oh, that's so nice.
I know, that's so beautiful.
Yeah, that I want that. That's definitely something I would hope people take away from it. So thank you for
You did
sharing
well.
that. Thank you.
So yeah, let's open it up to questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask or talk about?
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah.
So I was interested in, you were talking about the scientific method, and I was curious in your training as a scientist if there were courses or programs that are focused just on that and the history of that, because it seemed to me that part of the reason for it is because scientists are humans with limitations and biases. So I'm just, and you talked about that a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
So I guess I got a taste for that in a seminar during my PhD program at ESF, but it wasn't like a class that was repeatedly taught. It was like a couple faculty decided they wanted to teach a seminar on it that semester, and it was on the philosophy of science, and it was. That was like, I like that. That was actually, honestly, was one of the few. Like, I can identify a few, like, moments or experiences in my life that put me on like the trajectory I'm on, and that's one of the handful of things that I can like identify as being like very formative. And it wasn't because the readings or the faculty were great, but it was just the mere fact that we needed to that there was a whole field of people talking about what is science. Like, I'm in like SUNY ESF, the Environmental Science and Forestry College. It's a great school. It's a science school. And so all of my colleagues were scientists. And there are environmental studies, so there's some humanities, but it's very like science centric. And so I was pretty surprised that I was as like kind of alone in how excited I was about the topic in the class, because everyone else was like, I just want to go look at my frogs. Like, I mean, God bless them. I love my colleagues, my peers, but they were not that interested in like, I'm like, well, wait, like, what do you mean? Because part of that though is because I was a mycologist, that mycology, and I explain get a lot into this in the book, but mycology has been dismissed by the scientific institution for most of the history of science, because these organisms were not considered like knowable through the frameworks that we are typically deploying. So they were thought to be weird and dangerous and creepy and gross. So I immediately had like an application for like some of these theoretical philosophical questions of like, well, how do we produce knowledge? And because I'm looking at my study subjects and they're outside of the the reach of the scientific paradigm right now. So I was like, immediately had that, I guess, case study of like, well, yeah, the whole field of mycology, like fungi were just not engaged with. And so why was that the case? And so that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole. But I would say it's not taught enough. Like, I think you should be mandated to take a class like that if you have a degree in science. I think it's great for anyone in the humanities as well, though, just to have also, you know, a greater appreciation for the complexity of science. Why sometimes I think the critiques of scientists, even from very highly educated people, just belie a lack of understanding of how the science functions. So yeah, so I would say just in general, the philosophy of science, history of science. There's some, I'm always up for emails if you want a recommendation for particular texts. And I cite a few works in here as well that I particularly like put me on that track. Yeah, thank you for asking.
I know when I was attending ESF, there was a pretty like strict division between the people who were there for the hard sciences and the people who like the hard sciences. People really liked having things in their little boxes and I started out thinking I was in that camp, and then I took some environmental studies courses, and I had a similar like mind-blown emoji moment. And I think maybe part of what drew me and maybe you to it is that like the answers aren't always there, and like there's discussion to be had. And that's true with even the hard sciences, but it's not always talked about, and that's I also think people should maybe need to take these types of courses, because I feel like that's where I learned critical thinking, because it's looking at these ideas and reflecting them back on themselves and saying, why are we seeing this?
Right. Yeah.
Are you able to bring elements of your work in this book into your job?
A little bit, yeah. So I do a lot of, I guess it depends, because I'm new in my job. Like the New York State Museum, I've only been there for 2 years, so I'm still kind of, figuring out how I'm going to be in this position. But I did like curate an exhibit at the museum that's up now if you want to go to it. I talk about it, the scientist who's featured in the exhibit in the epilogue actually. Her name's Mary Banning, and she was a woman who was a mycologist who was in the 19th century, and she was one of the first North American mycologists, but her work was sort of lost to time on account of her being a woman. She's not explicitly queer, but I have speculated. So I did design an exhibit. It's called Outcasts, Mary Banning's World of Mushrooms, and it talks about the themes of like fungi being outcast organisms, and then they were more often than not studied by women who are not themselves allowed to be, in the sciences, or who were functionally very prohibited, even if they were technically allowed at certain points. So outcast organisms studied by outcast people, and so I do talk about this in as a the curator there, and the museum let me do a book event there, so I guess, which is nice. And then I think just I do a fair amount of public speaking and, free, not just book events, but like I'll do a mushroom walk and I'll teach people about, I'll thread these themes in, depending on the audience, and make, at higher or lower doses depending on what's going on. But yeah, so I would say that I feel, reasonably empowered to do that, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about the current assault on science?
It's very upsetting and alarming. I've had 2 NSF applications that were pending. And now I'm not sure, I spent months on preparing them, and with, plans for supporting my research for many years, and now I don't know if they'll be awarded. I immediately, I work thankfully for the state institution, so we're not subject to the same level of federal cuts, but it's really, I'm seeing all around me, all my colleagues are really struggling to know if they're going to be, have a lab next year, or if they're going to be able to pay grad students. I mean, it's pretty incredible, like in terms of the scale of this and like the unprecedented nature of it. I think it's very bleak, to be very honest. I think that, you know, yeah, I'm not in a great headspace about it. I don't know. I'm trying to see how dark I want to go right now, but I don't think it's I think it's bad, and I don't think it's going to get better for a long time. And I think, you know, as we erode our institutions, I think that can just start to pick up steam. So it's very, very troubling. Yeah, very troubling.
I personally, I don't understand the point of it because it seems so self-destructive.
Oh, it is self-destructive. Yeah,
I'm
it definitely
like,
is.
why are you doing that?
Personally, I think it's also an uneducated populace is one that's less likely to fight back. And I think that's part of why bridging the gap with like books and publishing, things that science education, things that people can access without that institution are becoming more and more important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that is probably the biggest goal is just to destroy higher education, so people are, you know, desperate workers, and so that the collective power, I think, is going to be. Queer people have known this for a long time. People of color have known this for a long time. But I think more and more people will be learning this a very hard lesson of how important it is to take care of each other. So I don't have, unfortunately, a uplifting thing to add to that at the moment, other than that I think we do know how to take care of each other.
But one of the things that you wrote, I mean, that is an overall theme in your book, is the fact that community matters.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But not just in the community of humans, but in all of the communities, right? And so is there a possibility, because this is one of the things I hold, I'm also very disturbed by what I'm seeing, but there's also another part, which is that there's institutionalized philanthropy that's happening that actually then makes the ability to expand what we know, to challenge the binary of there's only male and female and nothing else fits, so okay, that can't be good. If we break down some of those institutions, we invite in the potential that other people, other organizations will step forward and be like, I want you to study this. And I'm going to give you full funding for this.
That's a good point. No, that's a
and
really
instead
good point,
of it being like a handout, it becomes an opportunity for collaboration that's very different.
Right.
Because I think, and don't get me wrong, I want you to have all the money that you need. And I pay my taxes so you can have it. But at the same time, there's a question in my mind that maybe if we challenge it in a new way, that we might actually get to where we need to be.
I think that's that's a good point, and I definitely do agree. I think that I'm not actually someone who typically is highly I'm very critical of academic institutions in general. Like I do find that, and like there are a lot of issues with the way things have been organized, and I'm not necessarily defending the status quo. So I agree, and I think that all sorts of challenging situations do make space for reimagining, and I think that is something that we need to all be doing that reimagining work. So that's a good point. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. So you were talking a little bit about like with the Mary Benning like mushrooms work and like in general like the parallels between outcast like organisms and outcast like ideas and like outcast people who study them. Would you say that like ideas like that, like even like mycology as a field and like things like indigenous knowledge becoming more accepted in like the scientific canon, would you say that's sort of like a chicken or egg situation that started with the like more outcast people creating knowledge and like breaking into the scientific establishment, or would you say it started more with like the scientific establishment and like those systems of power realizing that there was like more knowledge that could be gained from these like?
It's a really good question. I don't think there's probably like one clear answer to that. Probably in different circumstances, different things. Like when I think about mycology, I know that for instance there's like pretty decent gender parity in the field and like professional positions, which isn't true for a lot of other organisms, and that's just because like women had long been doing the mycological work. and even in unpaid or like minimally paid ways. So like there's just been like an unbroken, like it never stopped being that way. It just became more and more has become more and more professionalized by, and women have just been in that position to take, they've been knowledgeable about those organisms. So I think there's like I think it's both. Like I think at times like there are ways in which like now there is this huge interest in mycology that's taken off over the last five or so years, which was strange for me to witness. Like, and part of it is that I think that, like, there, like I do think that people are sort of seeing the commercialization of it, like possibilities. Oh, I can make money off this. I can grow this thing. I can sell it. And so I do think that it is sometimes like driven by like the sort of dominant culture reaching into it and seeing opportunity. But then I think that there would be no knowledge of it had not people who were sort of weirdly committed to it without pay and without any sort of glory doing the work all along the way. So it's a bit of both, I think, depending on the field or the exact topic you're talking about. It'd be interesting to like, dive into the history of that specifically. Yeah.
I was actually interested in asking you about the kind of cultural boom around mushrooms recently. I don't live in the area, but I'm from New Jersey, and my grandparents actually, they were like children of immigrants who went back to Europe, but they foraged for mushrooms a lot around Litchfield County in Connecticut. And I remember growing up and being like, I don't get why they do this, because like the house that they built, they've since passed, but there's like mushroom memorabilia everywhere. Like now it's super camp, which I love. But it was really cool in the past like 5 years as like an artist and a librarian to see like a renewed interest in books around mushrooms. And like I've incorporated a lot of nature and mushrooms into my own work, but also seeing it like on stickers pretty regularly and like kind of puns about fungi, but also just fun facts and how it kind of has kind of integrated itself into this like kind of quirky, artsy situation. But it isn't, it isn't exclusively in queer spaces. But I was wondering if like you saw a connection with like modern queer culture and the rise of mycology, or I guess like based on your work in the museum so far, like if there's been any kind of trends that you've seen going on.
Yeah, so I did read this paper that came out in 2020 called The Science Underground Mycology as a Queer Discipline, and that was it's an academic paper in a sort of feminist journal, and like it goes into the history of mycology and how it sort of why it was perceived as strange and why there's aspects of queerness in it. It kind of is like a more academic version of some of the themes in this book, and then specifically about fungi. So I think that over time I was noticing sort of a parallel trend of like the growing acceptance of queerness and the growing acceptance of mushrooms. I now think we've taken a big, like very very tangible step backwards in queer sort of safety in the last few years, like year really. And time will tell how, all these things like in the zeitgeist, how they interplay, it's can be mysterious. But I would say that there was this, during COVID, a lot of people started reading nature books because they were stuck at home and they wanted to go outside. Like Braiding Sweetgrass, for example, was written in 2013, but it didn't become like on everyone's radar until 2020, until COVID. There was a huge boom in interest in being literate in the environment, and I think there's probably a lot of forces at play there, but I think part of it was just like people could go outside and they had time to in a new way, and it was the only thing that wasn't like fully closed. And it just, I don't know, I can't really explain it, of course. It's just something I noticed. Like every time I had my little forest spots in Syracuse at the time, and they were always incredibly full and with cars, and usually though for all of the years prior I was always the only person there, so it was like just anecdotally like a huge increase in park visitation. So I don't know, I mean I think it was just sort of a few factors at once, and it's led, but I do think sort of this willingness to sort of see ourselves in nature has been like growing, and I think that does coincide with an acceptance of other ways of being and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more.
I'm just curious, so in Europe, you know, where there is this culture where people are just more familiar with mushrooms, where they'll take their mushrooms to the pharmacy to see if they're, you know, toxic or not toxic or something. If you had an opportunity to have sort of reactions or feedback from like France or Germany or, you know, European countries where the culture of mushrooms is not like rise, you know, morning coffee, you know, but deeper in the culture.
Yeah, I'd say, I think part of it is like it's for people like, so I think it was very much a Western British culture of fungal, like mushroom phobia that has then took root in, so it's like a British European, like, but then, and then American kind of culture. And I can't fully answer as to why, except that there is just a lot of instances in European literature that talks about mushrooms with tremendous disgust and disdain. Then there was also like Linnaeus, who was one of the, you know, early founders of modern taxonomy and sorted species into groups, and like he like hated mushrooms. He was Swedish though, and he thought they were disgusting, and like they were lower plants, and they were not good at, they were plants, but they were bad plants. They were plants that are not good at being plants, right? And this was a pre-Darwinian time, so like they organized things in this like great chain of being, and so at the top were people, and then anything further down the chain was something like further from God. So at the bottom of the rung would be like spineless, creepy, you know, things, algae and molds, the horror. You know, it definitely is a European cultural thing, but obviously Europe is a dynamic place, and I think that I think a rebut, like I guess what I do notice is that there are people who are like, who do know their land really well and have for a long, long time, are often people who are not afraid of the things that are around them. So maybe there was still a mycophobic cultural element swirling about them, but they knew how to sort out the mushroom edible ones from the poisonous ones. They didn't need to be afraid of them, right? So I think that there's a lot of, I've written a lot about this, and so I can easily go off the rails, but I just try to say quickly that I think that it has to do with knowledge of place, deep ancestral knowledge of place, and repeatedly going to the same places, and that's not something that most Americans have. And so then you're detached from nature, and then you're fearful of it. And in American culture, to be like the unknown is not a good thing. It's a bad thing, right? We fear the unknown tremendously. We don't have space. We don't like leave much space for like the mystery, right? So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody.